Do you believe in God?
I believe there's some explanation for this universe, which you might call God.
Before I die, I need to tell you the truth. These are not just Elon Musk's words, they are a warning. What if everything you thought you knew about history, faith, and the origins of the Bible was only part of the story? And what if powerful institutions spent centuries deciding what you should and shouldn't see? Now imagine this, a version of the Bible, older than anything you've ever read, texts that were removed, hidden, or simply forgotten over time. Why were they taken out? Who made that decision? And more importantly, what do they contain? Some claim that even figures like Elon Musk have hinted at how much of human history remains undiscovered or deliberately ignored. Step back in time with us as we uncover forgotten knowledge, controversial claims, and untold stories surrounding the so-called original Bible. But be warned, what you're about to hear might challenge everything you believe. The earliest Christian writings, although it might sound shocking to you, the idea of an original Bible getting lost in history is nothing new. Being an avid reader who loves to learn everything about what he believes, it is no surprise the famous tech billionaire who once made waves by identifying as a Christian in an interview with Jordan Peterson is now looking into aspects of the religion that have been ignored and rejected by Christians for almost 2,000 years. This talk of an original Bible came at an interesting time when Jordan's new hit Bible series, The Gospels, was just starting to make waves on the internet. According to the historians they discussed, St. Paul, the man who wrote almost half of the books of the New Testament, was executed by Emperor Nero in 65 AD, barely 30 years after the death of Christ. This effectively means that all his letters were written before then, and with some of them quoting and paraphrasing sayings from the Gospels, it is safe to say those books were already written and widely distributed as well. But here is where it gets interesting. The last book of the New Testament, commonly known as the Book of Revelation, was written in 96 AD, and with no other apostle alive to write sacred letters about Christ to the churches, the New Testament was now complete. From then on, many ancient Christian scribes and scholars worked hard to gather all the writings and keep them safe, but the original scrolls couldn't last for long, and many churches needed all of them at once. To address this, they made thousands of copies of the New Testament and distributed them to the different churches. Keep in mind that this was a difficult time when nobody was sure which books to include in the Bible, as many widely distributed writings on the life and teachings of Christ looked suspicious. It took centuries to compile the New Testament books we have today. According to Elon, in 95 AD, barely a year before the book of Revelation was written, Clement of Rome, a man who was taught by disciples of St. Peter, already had 8 books from the New Testament in his collection. Over a decade later, in 108 AD, Polycarp, a popular disciple of St. John, acknowledged 15 books as sacred. The next public acknowledgement came 70 years later by another famous church father called Irenaeus. He authenticated 21 books as sacred, and Hippolytus, another leading church father, recognized 22 books as authentic. These books would become known as the Muratorian canon, and their approval was very important because too many fake gospel accounts and letters were out there. Great examples of these fake writings were the Epistle of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas, and the famous Book of Enoch, and these are just a few out of several. The big problem was that the average person back then either didn't know what made these books fake or why the early church fathers could be trusted in approving certain books as real and throwing out others as forgeries. Because of this, Elon points out that there was rising chaos and division over which books were original and which ones weren't, marking the first time in history when the idea of an original Bible came up. Recognizing that rising divisions might eventually tear the religion apart, Eusebius, the well-known historian and bishop of Caesarea, composed extensive works about Christian history and the origins of the widely recognized books. To reduce confusion, he organized the writings into 3 categories he named canonical, disputed, and spurious. The canonical books were those accepted by the earliest church leaders who had met eyewitnesses of Christ and the apostles. The disputed books were accepted by only some of the earliest church fathers, and many people still questioned whether they were genuine or false. Among these writings were the third epistle of John and the book of Revelation. The spurious books were the ones identified as false by the earliest leaders of the church who had known the apostles. Eusebius recorded all of this in his renowned work, Ecclesiastical History, an ancient text Elon Musk says he has been enjoying reading over the past few weeks. Because of his efforts, confusion about which books were genuine or false decreased, and even greater clarity came later through St. Jerome, the scholar famous for translating the sacred writings into the everyday language of Rome. Jerome came from Bethlehem, and after many years spent translating the scriptures, the books he confirmed eventually formed the same collection we read in our Old Testament Bibles today. But here is the twist: Constantine and the Church Council. From St. Peter's first imprisonment around 33 AD until the early 4th century, the Roman Empire created many hardships for Christians, and several attempts were made to interfere with the original collections of the sacred writings. The first major persecution occurred under Emperor Nero, a ruler who blamed Christians for the troubles Rome was experiencing at that time, including the massive fire that destroyed many crops and buildings. The blaze raged for nearly a week, consuming everything in its path before it was finally brought under control. Christians were blamed for this tragedy, and because of it they were arrested, tortured, and executed in brutal ways. In addition, many sacred writings were discovered and destroyed, and the same events happened again under Emperor Decius and Diocletian. They commanded that every scripture be destroyed. The devastation was so great that many historians believe this was the moment when numerous writings disappeared from history as part of an original Bible collection we no longer possess today. But a major turning point arrived on July 25th in 306 AD when Flavius Constantius, a notable ruler at the time who also opposed Christianity, died from an unexplained illness. His son Constantine was proclaimed the new ruler, yet he governed only one section of Rome, while the other 3 regions were ruled by different leaders. However, Constantine was not content with ruling only one part of the tetrarchy. He wanted authority over all of Rome. The challenge was, he was not the only one seeking the position of supreme emperor, since the other 3 leaders were already battling each other. The strongest rival among them was Maxentius, who controlled a large portion of Italy. In 312 AD, Constantine confronted Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, and what followed was astonishing. The night before the battle started, Constantine had a dream, and during this moment he looked toward the sky and saw a shining cross with these famous words, "By this sign you shall conquer." The cross had already become a well-known Christian symbol at that time, and believing he was being guided by the Christian God on how to achieve victory, he ordered his soldiers to paint the cross on their shields. Constantine believed he would win the battle by using that symbol, and the conflict began soon after sunrise. As expected, the battle was intense, yet even with the odds against them, Constantine's army finally defeated their enemies. The battle concluded on October 28th when Constantine pursued Maxentius to the Tiber River, where he drowned while attempting to flee. Convinced that the God of Christianity had granted him victory, Constantine converted to Christianity and made it legal to practice the faith the following year. This new decree spared many Christians from execution, and it became known as the Edict of Milan. Constantine encouraged several efforts to safeguard the sacred writings, and by that time all the books of our present New Testament were already recognized as genuine. However, serious disagreements were spreading among Christians, to the point that Constantine himself was unsure what to believe anymore. So, beginning on June 19th in 325 AD, just a year after becoming the sole emperor, Constantine gathered leading scholars and bishops from the Christian community for special discussions to help him understand these issues. These gatherings became known as the Council of Nicaea, and their conclusions were recorded in the Nicene Creed, a declaration of faith explaining what the religion taught and who could be recognized as a Christian. As for the Bible, all 27 books of the New Testament were confirmed, highlighted in the Easter letter written by St. Athanasius of Alexandria in 367 AD, where he described all the books as reliable historical writings. This brings us to the next stage in the search for the original Bible, the monastic communities. From the late 4th century, a new group began playing an important role in protecting the sacred texts throughout the Middle Ages. These men and women devoted their entire lives to their faith, living far away from society so they could focus on prayer, labor, and study. Their responsibility was copying the Bible by hand, since printing presses did not exist at that time. They carried out this work in special rooms known as scriptoria and usually wrote using quills dipped in ink. Their communities were called monasteries, and their manuscripts were often adorned with stunning illustrations known as illuminations. By the 12th century, a well-known theologian named Peter Lombard wrote a book called Sentences, where he explained several core teachings of the Christian faith using simple language. From his point of view, Peter only wanted to publish a book with his name attached to it, yet unexpectedly it also brought him great fame. Many scholars later wrote explanations about his work, including influential figures such as Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure. For them, Peter Lombard's writings were extremely valuable in clarifying the complex teachings presented by the early church fathers. What made it even more fascinating was that despite the strong support he received from the Christian community, many of his ideas were influenced by texts that had once been considered false. Because so much knowledge came from Peter Lombard's work, the church gradually became more accepting of these writings, and as a result, the monastic communities were instructed to produce additional copies of the Bible, including these texts that had once been labeled false and were now known as deuterocanonical books, or apocrypha. These writings were added to the scriptures and were treated with the same authority as the primary books. The Bible in those days was not as widely available as it is now, so only a limited number of people were aware of this change. Many were divided about the issue, and one of the strongest opponents was Martin Luther, a man whose writings would divide the church across Europe in unprecedented ways. Here is how it happened: the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther was a German monk and professor who was becoming more and more troubled by how the sacred writings were being treated at the time. He believed the leaders of the church were blending what the writings taught with tradition, collecting large sums of money from poor people in return for promises that they and their loved ones would find peace in the afterlife. Martin believed the Christian faith should be lived by grace through faith alone, and that no part of it should ever be purchased with money. He also spoke strongly against adding writings that were not sacred, insisting that the 66 books were already complete and sufficient for every good work. In his view, adding anything more to them was unnecessary. With these thoughts in mind, he wrote down his concerns and nailed them to the door of the large castle church in Wittenberg, Germany. This happened on October 31st, 1517, and he hoped that every scholar entering the church would at least stop and read them. However, what he meant to be a quiet discussion among church leaders quickly spread among the public, and within weeks, huge protests and riots erupted in several places. People were furious that their lives had been burdened by teachings that were not found in the sacred writings, and this growing resistance sparked the famous Protestant Reformation. 4 years later, Martin Luther was declared an outlaw by the authorities, and many followers of Rome wanted him executed. Realizing his life was in danger, Martin Luther took refuge at Wartburg Castle. While staying there, he noticed that many who opposed the Pope did not actually understand what they were fighting for, since most of them could not read the sacred writings themselves. Wanting to help the people, Martin Luther decided to translate the Bible for them. Believing the scriptures should be available to everyone, he immediately began the work. Instead of translating every word exactly, Martin chose a more natural approach because he wanted the translation to be clear and simple enough for ordinary people to understand. By the end of 1522, he had finished the New Testament and released it for everyone to read. Church leaders strongly opposed this because they feared that allowing ordinary people to read the sacred writings on their own would create confusion and disorder. Martin understood their concern but believed the risk was worthwhile, and by early 1534 he had translated all 66 books. Despite his earlier stance, he also translated the deuterocanonical books, but placed them in a separate section after the Old Testament, explaining that they were useful but not essential. His writings spread throughout Europe soon after they were published. At that time, many people could not read or write and depended on others to read the text aloud to them. But with Martin insisting that his Bible should be accessible for everyone to read personally, many people eventually learned to read so they could understand the scriptures themselves. Because of his efforts, literacy and education increased rapidly across Europe, and the leaders of Rome could no longer tolerate it. Martin had to be killed as an example so the people would obey. But unfortunately for them, he remained protected by powerful leaders like Frederick the Wise and the Elector of Saxony, both of whom admired his writings and learned greatly from him. The Elector even provided him a safe place to live and work, supplying everything he needed at all times. Sadly, as we will see, many of his followers were not as fortunate. John Wycliffe, a man who repeated many of the teachings he learned from Martin Luther, was expelled from the church, while his followers were publicly executed. Michael Sattler, an Anabaptist leader who also believed the sacred writings had been altered, was beaten and executed, while William Tyndale, the man famous for translating the Bible into English, was publicly burned at the stake. Soon after Tyndale's death, interest in biblical history grew again, and in 1536 another well-known reformer rose into prominence. His name was John Calvin, and he aimed to explain and defend the Reformed Church, especially its increasing rejection of the deuterocanonical books that were still considered sacred by the Church of Rome. He accomplished this through the release of his famous book, Institutes of the Christian Religion, and it became influential enough to inspire a new movement among Protestants called Calvinism. While the rest of the church accepted only the 66 books of the Bible as sacred, Calvin's followers, now called Calvinists, described them as inerrant, meaning the books were perfect and complete, containing no errors at all. While other Protestant groups believed the deuterocanonical books should be respected but not treated equal to the other scriptures, Calvinists insisted they were not sacred in any way, and that only the 66 books deserved full reverence. Calvin strongly opposed any belief suggesting the 66 books were incomplete. He rejected the idea of an original Bible containing books that had disappeared throughout history. He also believed the 66 books were not merely historical records, but were breathed out by God and written through human authors. Although these ideas seemed unusual at the time, their influence was undeniable, and it became most visible when the British and Foreign Bible Society chose to stop including the other books in the Bibles they printed beginning in 1826. Now this is where it gets wild: the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sometime in the late 1940s, a young shepherd living near Qumran, a region south of Jericho, was searching for his missing goat. He looked everywhere around his home but could not find it. Not long afterward, he discovered a cold, dark cave near the Dead Sea, and wanting to make sure no wild animal was hiding inside, he tossed a stone in and heard an unusual sound. Instead of a roar, what he heard was a soft crashing noise, like a shattered clay jar. Curious to discover what it was, the young man cautiously stepped into the cave and discovered several clay jars containing very ancient scrolls. He reported his discovery to the authorities, and soon they uncovered many more scrolls hidden in other caves along the coast. The scrolls were more than 2,000 years old, and they were early copies of the Hebrew Bible, containing every sacred book except Esther. But that wasn't the incredible part. These copies of the scriptures, even though they were far older than the manuscripts used to translate most modern Bibles, were over 95% identical to our present translations. The remaining 5% consisted mainly of spelling differences, too minor to change the main meaning of the text. The scrolls were written in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek, and they also contained extra rules, hymns, and explanations about many of the books. Another fascinating detail was that some rejected books of the Bible were also discovered among the scrolls, including the Book of Sirach and the Epistle of Jeremiah. This discovery revived interest in the question of which books might belong to the original Bible, since the Dead Sea Scrolls suggest that ancient Jews also considered these rejected books sacred. Yet even today, these writings continue to be rejected by the Protestant Church. And that brings us back to the biggest question: the original Bible. About 1 out of every 3 people today identifies as Christian. The Bible exists in many languages. More than 400 translations of the Bible are in English, directly adapted and revised from over 20,000 ancient manuscripts discovered in recent times. Even so, it is surprising that Christians are still divided about which book should be considered sacred. Most Christian scholars agree that the rejected books of the New Testament were not authentic. For instance, the Gospel of Thomas included many ideas that contradicted the 4 Gospels and was written more than 100 years after St. Thomas died. The Gospel of Mary was never widely accepted by the earliest churches, and the Acts of Paul, unlike the Acts of the Apostles, contained so many unusual claims that it was never taken seriously. The rejected books of the Old Testament also faced difficulties, with some written long after the death of Jesus. For example, the Book of Tobit disagrees with several New Testament teachings when it suggests giving money to the poor can rescue someone from death. 2 Maccabees implies that praying for the dead is acceptable, but the New Testament also challenges that idea. Things become even more confusing when we consider the Dead Sea Scrolls as evidence that many Jews treated these books seriously in ancient times. Elon seems to think these rejected writings may belong to the original canon of the Old Testament. As far as he understands, the ancient Jews who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls did not reject those books as less inspired than the others, and neither should modern readers. Still, this ancient debate continues among Christians today, and until a clear answer emerges, scholars keep searching to understand which books truly form the original content of the sacred writings. So what do you think? Are the rejected books of the Bible genuine, or should Elon simply find a new hobby? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Also, click the next video appearing on your screen. You are going to enjoy it.